Look who's here. The family failure finally got himself out of the gutter. My Uncle Harold's voice echoed through the wedding hall, cutting through the conversations like a sharp knife. I stood at the entrance of the elegant country club in Richmond, still adjusting the dark suit I had bought especially for the occasion. All eyes turned to me. Some people whispered. Others simply smiled with the kind of cruel amusement that families reserve for their most vulnerable members. Harold raised his champagne glass, clearly already altered by alcohol. Everyone, I'd like to introduce my nephew Andy. At 42, he still hasn't gotten a real job. He must be living off someone, right, kid? Discreet laughter echoed around the main table. My Aunt Margaret, the 65-year-old bride, nervously adjusted the pearls around her neck. Some guests looked away, embarrassed. Others remained curious, waiting for my reaction. My name is Andy Thompson, and at 42, I have just been publicly humiliated by the man who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 15. I kept my expression neutral, breathing slowly. Harold always took pleasure in belittling me, especially after I chose to pursue a military career instead of working for the family construction company. To him, anything outside the family business was synonymous with failure. What Harold didn't know was that I had come straight from a meeting at the Pentagon. Nor did he know that the car parked outside was an official Defense Department sedan with a driver waiting for my orders. And he definitely didn't know that the elegant woman sitting next to him, his new wife Margaret, had served under me for 3 years in Afghanistan. Margaret looked at me for a second, and I saw something familiar in her eyes. Recognition. Surprise. And then very slowly, an expression of absolute panic began to form on her face. Harold continued his performance. Margaret, dear, meet my nephew. The poor guy never managed to get his life together. He tried the military for a while, but obviously that didn't work out. He was probably discharged for incompetence. More laughter. More humiliation. I remained silent, watching Margaret grow visibly paler with every word that came out of my uncle's mouth. Because she knew exactly who I was. And she knew that Harold had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The country club was decorated with excessive elegance, white flowers on every table, crystal that reflected the golden lights, everything perfectly coordinated to project status and sophistication. Harold had always been obsessed with impressing people, and this late marriage to Margaret was his last attempt to prove he was still relevant at 68. If you're enjoying this story of family revenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this public humiliation turned into the most spectacular downfall a family has ever witnessed. As Harold continued his cruel speech, waiting for me to beg for forgiveness or run away in shame, Margaret was making desperate calculations in her head. Because there was something my dear uncle would never have imagined in his worst nightmares. The woman he had just married knew exactly where I stood in the American military hierarchy. Harold Thompson always had a knack for turning any family gathering into a makeshift courtroom, with himself as the supreme judge. At 68, he still ruled Thompson Construction with an iron fist, a company that had built half of Richmond's commercial buildings over the past 3 decades. For Harold, success was a simple equation: money plus power equals worth as a person. Anything outside that formula was a waste of time, a personal failure, and in my case, a constant disappointment that he made a point of announcing publicly whenever possible. You know, Margaret, he continued, turning to his wife with that cruel smile I had known since childhood, when Andy's parents died in that accident, I thought I finally had a chance to set this boy on the right path. I offered him a job at the company, a secure position, a stable future. Harold gestured dramatically with his glass. But no. The genius here preferred to play soldier. 27 years later, he still hasn't understood that war is a thing of the past. These days, it's the builders who matter, not the destroyers. Margaret had stopped smiling completely. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted and readjusted the napkin on her lap. She was doing that desperate mental calculation I recognized from countless command situations, when someone realizes they are in the middle of a catastrophe and must quickly decide between speaking or praying to go unnoticed. The truth is, Harold never offered me a job. He imposed work on me. At 15, orphaned and financially dependent on him, I spent every summer breaking rocks and carrying cement on construction sites. He called it building character, but it was just free labor disguised as a family favor. When I turned 18 and announced that I had enlisted in the army, Harold was silent for exactly 15 seconds. Then he exploded in a rage that shook the whole house. Are you going to throw away everything I've built for your family, he yelled. Are you going to abandon a solid business to play hero? This is pure ingratitude. But I had already made up my mind. I knew that staying would mean 20 years of doing what Harold told me, getting crumbs and being constantly reminded of how grateful I should be. The army offered something the family business never would, the chance to be judged on my own merits. Harold never forgave me for this betrayal. Throughout my career, he made a point of telling anyone who would listen about his failed nephew who abandoned his family to play soldier. At the rare family gatherings I attended over the years, Harold always found a way to belittle me. When I was promoted to sergeant, he said that anyone with brains eventually became a supervisor. When I became a lieutenant, he commented that officers were just expensive civil servants. When I reached captain, he stopped commenting on my promotions and pretended that my career simply didn't exist. To Harold, I was permanently frozen as that scared 15-year-old boy who showed up at his door after my parents' funeral. He never cared to find out who I had become. But Margaret knew. I could see it in the microscopic signs that only years of military command teach you to recognize. The tension in her shoulders, her shallow breathing, the way her eyes avoided mine while Harold continued his performance. She had served as a major in my division during our last operation in Afghanistan. 3 years of complex missions where I, as a brigadier general, made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Margaret had been one of my most competent officers, someone I trusted to coordinate civilian evacuations in hostile territory. And now she was sitting next to the man who called me a failure, knowing exactly where I stood in the American military hierarchy. Harold raised his glass again. Here's to my favorite failed nephew. May at 42 he finally learned that family and business are more important than military fantasies. Margaret closed her eyes for a second, as if praying for the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Because she knew that Harold had just publicly humiliated a 2-star general in the U.S. Army. And that I had remained silent not out of submission, but because I was calculating exactly how his arrogance would turn into the most spectacular fall this family had ever witnessed. The problem didn't stop there. Harold was just warming up. Everyone, since we have everyone's attention, Harold rose from his chair, still waving his champagne glass. I want to tell you a story about my nephew here. A true story about gratitude and failure. The room fell silent. Even the orchestra stopped playing. Margaret had become a marble statue, her hands clutching her napkin as if it were a lifeline. When Andy was 15, Harold began, circling the head table like an inspirational speaker, his parents died in a terrible accident. My late wife, Linda, and I opened our home and our hearts to this boy. We gave him love, an education, opportunities. He gestured dramatically in my direction. I offered him a job at my company, which now employs over 200 people in Richmond. A company that builds the future, that puts up buildings, that creates real jobs. But no. Our young hero preferred to play soldier. Nervous laughter echoed through the hall. Some guests looked uncomfortable, but most were clearly enjoying the spectacle. It was like watching a car crash, horrible, but impossible to ignore. And you know what 27 years of playing soldier got him? Harold paused dramatically. He came home with nothing. No job, no family of his own, no future. At 42, he still hasn't figured out that real life isn't an action movie. My cousin Robert, Harold's oldest son, raised his glass. Dad always said you did everything you could for Andy, but some people just don't know how to take advantage of opportunities. Aunt Diane, Harold's sister, shook her head sadly. It's a shame to see young people waste their lives. If only he had listened to Harold from the beginning. That's when something inside me broke. Not from pain or humiliation, but like when a stretched rope finally snaps. 27 years of military service, 3 general stars, combat decorations, responsibility for thousands of lives, and they saw me as a failure because I chose to serve my country instead of stacking bricks. Harold continued. The worst part is, he could have had it all. My company is worth $8 million today. He could have been my partner, my successor. But he chose to chase uniforms and medals that are worthless in the real world. Margaret whispered something in Harold's ear, desperately trying to stop him. But he was too drunk on his own venom to notice his wife's signs of panic. No, honey, Harold brushed her hand away, let me finish. It's important for people to know how hard it is to deal with ungrateful relatives. Andy had every opportunity and threw it all away. He turned directly to me. Tell me, nephew, What exactly did you get out of this military adventure? Some measly pension? A security job at a mall? Or are you unemployed like so many other veterans? The silence that followed was thick as fog. All eyes were on me, waiting for an answer, a defense, maybe tears or anger. But I was doing calculations. Calculating how long Margaret had been married to Harold, 6 months, according to the invitation. Calculating when she had left active duty, 8 months ago, when she finished her last assignment under my command. Calculating the probability that she had mentioned her military career to her new husband. 0. Margaret had clearly erased her military past from her new civilian life. Andy. Harold insisted, now clearly annoyed by my silence. Aren't you going to answer? Or don't you have an answer because you know I'm right? That's when I made my decision. For years, I had kept my military career separate from my family. Not out of shame, but out of protection. I knew Harold would turn any of my achievements into a reason for competition or criticism. So I simply stopped sharing. He interpreted my silence as confirmation of failure. Margaret interpreted it as a need to keep military secrets. But now, seeing Harold publicly humiliate not only me, but indirectly all the men and women who serve in the armed forces, I decided that protection was over. Harold, I said finally, my voice calm but carrying a tone that made the entire room pay attention, you're right about one thing. I really should have been more open about my career. Margaret closed her eyes as if in prayer. And since you insist on talking about failures and successes, I continued, slowly pulling my cell phone out of my pocket, maybe it's time to clear up some misunderstandings. Harold smiled, thinking he had finally provoked me enough to make me burst into tears or rage. Great. Let's hear about your great achievements, soldier. I scrolled through my phone until I found what I was looking for. An official Pentagon photo taken the week before. An award ceremony where I stood in the center, 3 stars shining on my uniform, flanked by other high-ranking officers. Actually, I said, raising my voice slightly so everyone could hear, you're right that I should share more about my work. Especially considering that your wife knows my current position very well. Margaret had turned pale as a sheet. Harold frowned, confused. What are you talking about? I turned my phone so he could see the screen. I'm talking about the fact that Margaret served under me for 3 years in Afghanistan. As a major in the U.S. Army, she reported directly to me. The sound that followed was like air being sucked out of the room. Harold looked at the screen, then at Margaret, then at me, and back at the screen. That's, he began. An official Pentagon photo, I finished. Taken last week during a ceremony where I received my 3rd star as a general. Harold staggered slightly. General. General in the U.S. Army. Currently commanding the division responsible for strategic operations in the Middle East. My voice remained calm, almost casual. Margaret can confirm this, as she worked on my team coordinating civilian evacuations in combat zones. All eyes turned to Margaret, who looked as if she were about to faint. And that's when Harold's real humiliation began. Because he realized that for the last 20 minutes he had publicly called one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military a failure. In front of all his family, his friends, and his wife, who had hidden from him the fact that she had served under the man he had just publicly destroyed. The silence in the hall lasted exactly 15 seconds. 15 seconds that seemed like an eternity as Harold processed the information that he had spent the last 20 minutes publicly humiliating a 3-star general in the U.S. Army. Margaret finally found her voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. Harold, I can explain. Explain. Harold turned to her, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Explain how you forgot to mention that you worked for my nephew? That he's a damn general. I didn't forget, Margaret said, each word coming out with difficulty. I chose not to tell you because I knew how you would react. Harold laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. How would I react? My wife served under the man I just called a failure in front of 200 people. The guests began whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the drama unfolding. Some were already discreetly making their way toward the exit. I remained where I was, watching the chaos unfold, when my cell phone vibrated. A message from the driver, "General, do you need anything?" That was when I made a decision. For 27 years, I had kept my military life completely separate from my family. I had protected Harold from knowing exactly who he was dealing with. But that protection was over the moment he decided to make a joke out of my military service. "Margaret," I said calmly, "would you come outside with me for a moment? There are some things we need to clear up." Harold stepped between us. "No. You're not dragging my wife into your military games. You've caused enough trouble." I looked at him with the same expression I used when soldiers question direct orders. "Harold, your wife is a retired officer of the United States Army. She can make her own decisions about who she talks to." Margaret stood up slowly. "Harold, I need to talk to General Thompson. It's service-related." "General Thompson?" Harold repeated, as if the words were poison in his mouth. We stepped out onto the club's terrace, away from prying eyes. The driver was waiting discreetly near the entrance, a uniformed man who was clearly not a simple app driver, but military security. "Margaret," I began, "how many people here know about your military career?" She shook her head. "No one. When I married Harold, he made it clear that he preferred I not mention my military background. He said it would interfere with the image he wanted to project as a couple." "He asked you to hide your career?" "He didn't exactly ask me to. But it was clear that was the expectation." Margaret looked through the window at Harold, who was gesturing furiously at some relatives. "He has this very traditional view of women's roles. He wanted a wife who would complement his image as a successful businessman." I nodded, doing some mental calculations. Margaret had been an excellent officer, decorated for valor in combat. The fact that she had agreed to erase that part of her identity to please Harold said a lot about how he operated. "Margaret, do you remember Operation Anchor Point?" She blinked, clearly surprised by the change of subject. "Sure. The evacuation of civilians in Kandahar." "Why?" "Do you remember the journalists who were covering the operation? Specifically, David Chun from CNN and Rachel Morrison from the Washington Post." "Yes, they documented the entire operation. They won awards for their reporting." If you're following this story of how a family humiliation is turning into the downfall of an arrogant businessman, subscribe to the channel because revenge is just beginning to take shape. "They're still my direct contacts," I continued. "And they'd love a story about how a civilian businessman publicly humiliates a decorated general, especially a general who commanded operations that saved hundreds of lives." Margaret went pale. "Andy, you can't be thinking about—" "I'm not thinking about anything yet. I'm just taking inventory of available resources." I paused, watching Harold through the window. "But I'm also curious about something. Does Thompson Construction have any government contracts?" "Yes, several. Harold constantly brags about the military base contracts he secured in recent years." "Interesting. And would you happen to know if those contracts went through proper bidding processes? Or if there was any kind of political influence?" Margaret hesitated. "Why are you asking that?" "Because, as a high-ranking officer, I have access to military contracting records. And I have a responsibility to ensure that businessmen who publicly disrespect the armed forces do not receive contracts funded by American taxpayers." We returned to the hall, where Harold was clearly trying to control the damage, explaining to guests that there had been a misunderstanding about my position. When he saw me enter, he approached with a forced smile. "Andy, perhaps we can talk in private. Clearly there has been some confusion here." "There was no misunderstanding, Harold. You said exactly what you thought. Look, I didn't know about your achievements. Margaret never mentioned them. And why should she? You made it clear that her military career wasn't important enough to be part of her identity as your wife." Harold opened and closed his mouth several times. "That's different. She's a woman." And with that sentence, he completely sealed his fate. Because it wasn't just Margaret listening. There was also retired Colonel Janet Phillips, who was married to Harold's partner, Robert Chun. There was Major Lisa Rodriguez, wife of the mayor of Richmond. And there were at least 6 other female veterans at the party, all of them now looking at Harold as if he were something that needed to be removed from their lives. I smiled for the first time since I arrived. "Harold, you have a very interesting view of military value based on gender. I'm sure journalists will be fascinated to explore that perspective. You can't be serious about calling the press." "I don't need to call them. They call me regularly." I took my phone out of my pocket. David Chun texted me 2 hours ago, asking if I had any interesting stories for him. Harold was sweating now. Andy, we're family. Can't we work this out between ourselves? Family. I repeated. You spent 27 years treating me like a failure. Today you humiliated me in public. And now you want to appeal to family ties. That's when my cell phone rang. The number on the screen made Harold even paler. It was the Pentagon. General Thompson, I answered, keeping the speakerphone on. General, this is Colonel Martinez from the Contracts Command. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Some contracts in the Richmond area are being questioned for possible irregularities. Harold was staring at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake. What kind of irregularities, Colonel? Targeted bids, altered documentation, possible corruption. Thompson Construction is at the center of the investigation. Harold staggered backward, knocking over a chair. Understood, Colonel. I'll be available to review the files Monday morning. I hung up the phone and looked at Harold, who now looked like he was about to faint. What an interesting coincidence, I said calmly. It seems your company was already under investigation. And now, as the officer responsible for approving military contracts in the region, I will have to personally examine every document. Harold finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't just humiliated a general, he had humiliated the general responsible for overseeing his most lucrative government contracts. And I was just beginning to show him what a failed military man could really do when he decided to stop being polite. General Thompson? The voice came from behind me. I turned and saw a man in a dark suit approaching. I'm Federal Agent Marcus Wheeler, FBI. Could I have a word with you? Harold turned white as a sheet. FBI? What? Why is the FBI here? Agent Wheeler ignored Harold completely, addressing only me. General, we have received information about possible irregularities in military contracts. Would you accompany us for an official conversation? Of course, I replied calmly. But first, there are a few things that need to be clarified here. I turned to face Harold, who was now visibly shaking. Harold, you asked me what I got out of my military adventure. Let me answer that fully. I took out my cell phone and opened a specific folder. Over the past 27 years, I have commanded operations that have saved thousands of lives. I have been awarded 3 stars as a general. I have direct access to the Pentagon and authority over military contracts worth billions of dollars. Harold tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. But more importantly, I continued, I've developed a network of contacts that includes investigative journalists, federal agents, and government auditors. People who take a keen interest when a civilian businessman publicly disrespects military officers. I showed Harold my phone screen. It was a recording. His entire speech humiliating me had been discreetly filmed by the military driver waiting outside. This recording has already been sent to 5 different media outlets, I said calmly. In 2 hours, the entire country will know how Harold Thompson treats military veterans. Margaret jumped up from her chair. Harold, you don't understand. Andy isn't just a general. He's the general responsible for approving contracts in the Southeast. All your military contracts go through his desk. The realization hit Harold like a freight train. No, that's not possible. More than possible, Agent Wheeler interjected. It's reality, Mr. Thompson. And considering that your company is under investigation for bid rigging, publicly attacking the officer responsible for overseeing those contracts was, let's just say, not very strategic. Harold staggered, looking for support on a chair. Andy, we're family. You can't be doing this because of some pranks. Pranks. My voice cut through the air like a knife. 27 years of calling me a failure. Today, humiliating me in front of 200 people. Saying that women in the military are worthless. I looked around the room. All the guests were silent, watching the catastrophe unfold. Harold, you said war is a thing of the past. That it's the builders who matter. I paused, letting the silence work in my favor. Well, you were right about one thing. I did build something important. What? He whispered. His downfall. At that moment, Harold's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen and turned even paler. It's the office, accounting. Answer it, I suggested gently. Harold answered with trembling hands. Even from a distance, we could hear the accountant's agitated voice. Mr. Thompson, the military contracts have all been suspended. The bank is freezing the company's accounts. And journalists are calling asking about allegations of fraud. Harold hung up the phone and looked at me with an expression of pure terror. How did you do that? With a single call to the military audit department, I replied. I reported that I had witnessed inappropriate behavior by a civilian contractor toward military officers. They take these things very seriously. Margaret approached Harold, but he pushed her away angrily. You knew who he was and you didn't tell me. I tried to warn you, Margaret replied, tears welling up in her eyes. But you never listened to me. You never cared about my military career. Because you're a woman. Harold exploded. Women don't understand these things. That's when Colonel Janet Phillips rose from her desk. I understand perfectly, she said, her voice carrying decades of military authority. I understand that you have just insulted not only a 3-star general, but every woman who has served our country. More voices joined in. Major Lisa Rodriguez. Retired Sergeant Karen Mills. One by one, the women veterans in the room stood up, forming a silent but intimidating circle around Harold. Harold looked around, realizing finally that there was no escape. Andy, please, can we talk in private? There's nothing to talk about, I replied. You made your choices. For 27 years, you chose to belittle me. Today, you chose to humiliate me publicly. Now you live with the consequences. Agent Wheeler approached again. Mr. Thompson, we need you to come with us for some questions about your company. As Harold was escorted out, he turned one last time. You destroyed your own family because of pride. I smiled for the first time all night. No, Harold. You destroyed the family because of arrogance. I just protected myself. And as the doors closed behind him, I knew that Harold was about to discover that insulting a 3-star general in the U.S. Army had consequences that would extend far beyond a ruined marriage. His real downfall was just beginning. 6 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my new office in Washington, watching the city bustle below me through the 15th floor windows. The phone rang. It was Margaret. Andy, you need to know. Harold was officially indicted for federal fraud this morning. I closed my eyes for a moment. There was no satisfaction in the news, just a heavy sense of inevitability. How is he handling it? Badly. Very badly. Margaret's voice carried a mixture of sadness and relief. The company went completely bankrupt last week. He lost his house, his cars, everything. He's living with his cousin Robert in a 1-bedroom apartment. For the past 6 months, I had watched the systematic downfall of Harold Thompson. First came the federal investigations into fraudulent military contracts he had secured through falsified documentation and bribes dating back 8 years. The initial discovery led to a broader investigation that revealed a staggering pattern of corruption. Harold had created shell companies to inflate costs, bribed inspectors to approve substandard materials, and forged safety certifications on projects that involved the lives of hundreds of people. Then came the media exposure. The recording of Harold humiliating me at the wedding went viral, viewed by more than 2 million people in 72 hours. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into Thompson Construction, and what they found shocked even the most seasoned reporters. But the final blow came from where Harold least expected it, from his own victims. The report on his treatment of military veterans encouraged dozens of former employees to come forward. Stories of discrimination, bullying, unpaid wages, and illegal working conditions began pouring in like an unstoppable avalanche. Maria Santos, a civil engineer who had been fired for questioning the quality of materials used in a school, finally found the courage to speak out. I knew those bricks didn't meet specifications, she said in a televised interview. When I confronted Harold, he told me women didn't know anything about construction and fired me on the spot. Thomas Riley, a Vietnam veteran who had worked for the company for 12 years, revealed how Harold systematically denied promotions to employees who served in the military reserves. He said soldiers didn't have the discipline for real business. Ironic, considering that his biggest contracts came from the military government. The story that impacted me the most came from Janet Morrison, an accountant who had discovered the financial irregularities 2 years earlier. "I took the evidence directly to Harold," she told federal investigators. "He looked me in the eye and said that if I said anything, he would make sure I never worked in Richmond again. Then he offered me a promotion and a raise to keep me quiet." Janet had accepted the bribe out of fear, but she kept copies of all the documents. When the investigation began, she was one of the first to cooperate with the authorities. "Andy," Margaret continued on the phone, "there's something else. Harold is trying to blame you for everything. He says you orchestrated a conspiracy to destroy him out of personal revenge." I smiled bitterly. "And what do you think of that?" "I think," she said, with a firmness I hadn't heard in her voice in years, "that a man who spends 27 years systematically humiliating someone has no right to complain when the consequences finally catch up with him." Margaret had changed in the last few months. The divorce had been finalized in record time. She had meticulously documented how Harold had forced her to hide her military career, how he constantly belittled her, how he used her military retirement money to finance his business schemes without her knowledge. She now worked as a security consultant for companies that hired veterans, using her military experience to help former soldiers reintegrate into civilian life. For the first time in years, she was proud of who she was. "You know what else?" Margaret laughed, but there was no cruelty in the sound. "I got an amazing job offer yesterday. A security company in Denver wants me to head up their veteran recruitment division. I'm moving there next month." "Congratulations, Margaret. You deserve all the happiness in the world." "Andy, thank you for showing me that it's possible to stand up for yourself without becoming like your abusers." After I hung up, I reflected on how the last few months had changed not just Harold, but the entire ecosystem around him. Thompson Construction wasn't just a corrupt company, it was a symbol of how powerful men used their position to diminish and exploit others. When Harold fell, he took an entire network of complicity down with him. 3 city employees were indicted for accepting bribes. 5 inspectors lost their licenses permanently. 2 local politicians who received questionable donations faced impeachment proceedings. But most important were the positive changes that emerged from the wreckage. 3 new construction companies, all led by veterans and committed to ethical practices, emerged to fill the vacuum left by Thompson Construction. The mayor of Richmond implemented new transparency policies for municipal contracts, requiring multiple approvals and regular audits. A non-profit organization called Building Futures was created specifically to help veterans start their own construction businesses, offering microcredit, mentoring, and technical support. Even more significant was the impact on the local military community. Harold's story had exposed systematic bias against veterans at several companies in the area. This led to the creation of a city council for veterans' rights and new state laws protecting former military personnel from discrimination in the workplace. My cell phone vibrated with a news notification. It was an article about Harold, but not the kind I was expecting. The headline read, "Convicted former businessman launches social reintegration program for ex-convicts." I read it quickly. Harold, now awaiting sentencing, had started volunteering at an organization that helped people recently released from prison find honest work. According to the article, he was using his construction experience to teach practical skills to men who, like him, had lost everything due to their own choices. "When you lose everything you thought to find who you were," Harold had told the reporter, "you finally have a chance to find out who you really are." Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at the irony. But instead, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Perhaps it was possible that even Harold Thompson could learn something from his downfall. 3 days later, I received an unexpected envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter in the shaky handwriting I recognized immediately. "Andy, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I need you to know that I understand now. Not just what I did to you, but what I've become over the years. When your parents died, I promised them I would take care of you. But instead of nurturing your potential, I tried to mold you to fit my own insecurity. Every achievement of yours threatened my illusion of superiority. You became exactly the man your parents hoped you would be: courageous, honest, loyal to what is right. I became someone they would be ashamed to know. In prison, I've had time to reflect on the lives I've destroyed. Not just yours, but those of dozens of employees, families who trusted in structures I knowingly built with inadequate materials, veterans who deserved respect and found only contempt. I can't undo 27 years of cruelty. But I can guarantee that the years I have left will be dedicated to trying to repair the damage I've caused, not just to you, but to all the people I treated as less valuable because they didn't follow my path. I've learned something here that I never knew when I had power. True value doesn't come from how much you can accumulate, but from how much you can lift others up. Your uncle, Harold. I folded the letter and put it in my drawer. It wasn't an absolution, but it was a start. That night, I called Margaret. Harold wrote me a letter. What are you going to do? Nothing for now. But maybe when he gets out of prison, we'll talk. Not about reconciliation, but about responsibility. You're more generous than he deserves. It's not about what he deserves. It's about who I choose to be. 2 weeks later, I attended a ceremony at the Capitol where the Protecting Veterans in the Workplace Act was passed. As I watched the congressman sign the legislation, I thought about how one night of humiliation had turned into systemic change that would protect thousands of future veterans. Colonel Martinez, who had conducted the initial investigation into Harold, approached me after the ceremony. General Thompson, I wanted you to know that your courage in exposing corruption has inspired others to speak up. We now have 17 similar cases under investigation in 7 states. It's about justice, not revenge, I replied. The difference being? Revenge is personal and temporary. Justice is systematic and lasting. 6 months after that, I received an unexpected invitation. The University of Richmond wanted me to give a lecture to business students on business ethics and responsible leadership. The lecture was scheduled for the main auditorium, which seats 500 people. When I arrived, there wasn't an empty seat in the house. Among the audience, I recognized familiar faces: Margaret, who had flown in from Colorado, several former Thompson Construction employees who now ran their own companies, and in the back of the auditorium, almost unrecognizable, Harold. He had lost weight, his hair was completely gray, and he was wearing simple clothes instead of the expensive suits he used to wear. Our eyes met for a moment. He didn't smile, just nodded, a gesture of recognition and perhaps respect. During the lecture, I talked about integrity, about the difference between command and leadership, about how true power comes from the ability to lift others up rather than tear them down. Leadership isn't about getting people to follow you, I told the students. It's about inspiring them to become better versions of themselves. A student raised her hand. General, how do you deal with people who try to diminish or sabotage you? I paused for a moment, thinking about my answer. First, you need to understand the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is emotional and immediate. Response is considered and strategic. I glanced briefly in the direction where Harold was sitting. Second, you need to decide whether you want to defeat the person or transform the situation. Defeating someone is temporary. Transforming a system is permanent. What if the person keeps trying to undermine you? Then you document, protect yourself legally, and let the natural consequences of his actions do the work. Destructive people eventually destroy themselves. Your responsibility is to ensure that you don't get taken down with them. After the lecture, Harold approached me hesitantly. Andy, can I talk to you? We walked silently to a bench on campus. Autumn was beginning, and the golden leaves created a contemplative atmosphere. Your lecture was enlightening, he said finally. Harold, why did you come? Because I needed to hear what you've become. Not just professionally, but as a person. He paused, looking down at his hands. And because I wanted to apologize. Not to get forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear it. We stood there in silence for a few minutes. You know what I learned in prison? Harold continued. That you can spend 20 years building a company and a reputation, and you can destroy both in a single night of arrogance. And what do you intend to do with that lesson? Try to repair what I can. Not just financially, that will take the rest of my life. But morally. By treating people with the dignity they've always deserved. Today, 5 years after that disastrous wedding, I can say that the real victory wasn't Harold's downfall. It was the discovery that it is possible to face systematic humiliation without becoming a cruel person. It is possible to demand accountability without seeking destruction. It is possible to be strong without being ruthless. Harold now runs a reintegration program for ex-convicts and, ironically, has become one of the most vocal advocates for veterans' rights in Richmond. Not out of legal obligation, but out of genuine conviction. Margaret now heads the largest veteran security consulting firm in Colorado and is engaged to a retired colonel she met at a military leadership conference. Thompson Construction has been replaced by 5 smaller companies, all committed to ethical practices and run by people who value integrity over profit. Harold tried to teach me that power is about domination. Life has taught me that true power is about elevation, of oneself and others. Some may say I went too far in my response that night. I say I went exactly where justice demanded. And Harold? Well, today he's learning that building people is harder, and more rewarding, than building buildings. If this story of family triumph has inspired you and you want to see more stories about how ordinary people have faced injustice and been transformed by the process, subscribe to the channel now. We have dozens of stories that show how dignity always beats arrogance, and how sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming the best version of yourself. The final lesson I learned is that you can destroy someone who humiliates you, or you can transform the system that allows humiliation to happen. The first option satisfies the ego temporarily. The second changes the world permanently. And when Harold discovered that he had spent 27 years trying to diminish a 3-star general, he learned the hard way that underestimating people never ends well for those who underestimate them.